Now I'm going to show some of the steps in pre-mixing, but I'll move fairly quickly through some of these. But at this point, because we're really trying to focus on the impact of bulk fermentation, every time we touch the dough from the very beginning of this process impacts the open crumb. So I want to include that on the video to make sure that you have the full spectrum of the experiment here for future reference. You can fast forward through some of these sections if you want to, but I try to include everything in these videos that's germane to the outcome. So if I don't think it impacts the outcome, I wouldn't have included it in the video in the first place. But you're in control of the fast forward button, so you can do as you please. If you're not familiar with the Tartine Basic Country Loaf recipe, I go through this recipe in great detail in my original video series, The Sourdough Journey, Beginner Mistakes and Tips. If you want any more detail on how this recipe works and what these techniques are, that 5-part series goes through every step in tremendous detail. Okay, I am finally going to put something in a bowl and start making bread. So the first step in bulk fermentation is to make your leaven. I made this leaven the night before from my starter. This more than doubled in size. This is pretty far along. I do the float test even though the float test is unreliable. It's recommended in the Tartine recipe, and because I use the exact same formula for my starter as Chad Robertson uses in that book, it usually floats. You can see there it's floating. The float test, like I said, it's not 100% reliable. It depends on what your starter content is made of. It depends on how far along your leaven is. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. If it works, it's a good sign. If it doesn't work, it doesn't necessarily mean that your starter is not ready. So some people hate the float test. I still do it, but I don't put a tremendous amount of weight on it because I know that I have a strong starter and I can tell when my leaven is ready. That just comes through experience. And this is what drives people crazy about the float test, is just in the time I've been talking, half of my starter is floating and half of it sank to the bottom. Did it pass or did it fail? Who knows? That's why this test is interesting, but I don't put tremendous weight on it. So today what I'm using for my bread flour is the Central Milling Company Organic High Mountain High Gluten Flour. I just switched over to this recently. I was using the King Arthur Organic Bread Flour, which has 12.7% protein. This has 13.5% protein, a little bit higher protein content. I've been really happy with how the Central Milling Flour is working for me. King Arthur bread flour has been tough to find recently, so I switched over to Central Milling and I like it. I use the King Arthur whole wheat organic flour for the 10% whole wheat flour. Okay, the first thing I do here is combine the leaven with the water. You can see this leaven looks really good. This is a little further along than usual. I make this overnight, so it sat for just about 12 and a half hours at a low temperature. It was about 68 degrees Fahrenheit. Then I add the water. This is exactly 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 26.7 degrees Celsius. That's what's called for in the recipe. There we are. And I mix this with a whisk. So I have this beautiful, bubbly, frothy leaven milkshake. And then I start to add the flour. I pre-mix my flour in a separate bowl, so I combine the bread flour with the whole wheat flour, so I get a good distribution of the two. So as soon as the flour, the water, and the leaven are combined, this really starts the fermentation process. So I note the time on my worksheet here. This is called a Fermentolyse, not an autolyse. Fermentolyse is because we've added the leaven at this point. Some people do an autolyse where you just combine the water and flour and let that sit for a while. And what that does is it starts to condition the flour It really hydrates and conditions and starts to release enzymes and chemicals in the flour and actually starts to develop some of the gluten. As soon as water and flour combine, you'll start to get some gluten development. The tartine recipe does not call for autolyse or a long autolyse. It uses the Fermentolyse where it adds flour, water, and the leaven all at the same time. Now I'm turning the flour, water, and leaven together with my dough scraper, with my bowl scraper. And as soon as I start touching this, I'm building gluten. So you want to think about how long you're spending on this step of the process. The tartine recipe is a very light touch, hands-off type of recipe, so it does not do a lot of heavy kneading or mixing of the dough. It essentially says as soon as this is a shaggy ball where all the raw flour is off the sides of the bowl, you should stop handling it. I'm going to go around a few more times here. I still see a little raw flour in the bottom. You don't want to see clumps of flour in the dough. That's why I'm continuing around a little bit more, because I'm still seeing lumps in here. But I'm really not trying to overwork the dough. At this point, I'm just combining ingredients. Okay, that's a little bit past what I'd call a shaggy ball. It's starting to get sticky, which in the tartine recipe it says when it's starting to get sticky, that's definitely when you stop this process. Again, it's a light touch mixing, pre-mixing. So now I'm going to let this sit for 40 minutes and let all these ingredients combine. Okay, it's been 40 minutes, so our autolyse slash Fermentolyse is done. Let me just take the internal dough temperature. This is sitting right at 82 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 27.8 degrees Celsius. That's the high end of the recommended range for bulk fermentation. I'm keeping this in the oven with my light turned on, or I was, to get it up to this temperature. I'll probably just leave it on the countertop now and manage the temperature between 78 degrees and 82 Fahrenheit is where we want to be. This 25.5 Celsius to 27.8 Celsius is the target range. So we're a little bit on the high end of the range right now. So I just manage it between the countertop and the oven with the light turned on. Okay, it's time to add the salt. I always pre-measure my salt. I put it out here in a visible place before I start doing anything, because you don't want to forget to add the salt. It's a very common mistake people make. Some people dissolve the salt in water. I actually prefer to put it on dry. I feel like I get a little better distribution. And then there's a little bit of reserved water from the original amount of the recipe that you then add in on top. So I'm doing a dissolve of the flour on top. Okay, so now let's just pause for a minute. So at this step in the process, before I mix in the salt, what's happened? We added the leaven, the water, and the flour. Mixed that together for 40 minutes. We started to develop gluten. As soon as the water hits the flour, it starts to develop gluten. As soon as I started handling the dough, it developed gluten. And then as the yeast starts to create carbon dioxide, it does what I call that micro kneading, where it starts to stretch tiny little stretches in the dough. It's also developing gluten. This is the next step where we're going to now help develop gluten. I added the water and the salt. And now as I mix this in, I'm doing a lot of handling of the dough. And that stretching of the dough also creates gluten. So this is an important step in the gluten creation as part of the bulk fermentation process. So the way I mix this in is I just grab the dough on the sides and fold. This dough already looks nice. You can see it pulling away from the sides of the vessel nicely. And when beginners do this for the first time, this tartine recipe, you think you've done something wrong here because it's so incredibly wet. You can see there's, that added water that I put in here is still sloshing around in the bottom of the bowl. It will eventually all mix in here. It just takes a little time. But this is a pretty high hydration recipe. I think it's 78% when you include the water in the leaven. So at this point, I'm really just trying to incorporate the salt in this very wet mix. So now that the salt is incorporated, I'm going to continue to work this a little bit to get more of that water incorporated into the flour, because this is really still wet. So I'm going to continue to work this, and I'm building gluten as I'm doing this. I'm just glancing at the clock. I'll probably do this for about 2 or 3 minutes. You can see it's starting to firm up and come away from the sides of the bowl. And you can see that water is now disappeared from the bottom of the bowl as the water gets absorbed into the flour. And every time I'm pulling this and folding it over, I'm building more and more gluten here. So let me pause here for a minute. In the tartine recipe is an incredibly hands-off recipe. When you actually look at the amount of time that's recommended for actually touching the dough, it is really light. It is really a light touch recipe. It's relying on the yeast to do a lot of the work in terms of gluten creation. In this example, because we're doing a no-knead recipe, we're doing coil folding, which are a little bit, from no additional handling. Coil folding is a little bit lighter handling. I'm doing a little bit more pre-mixing here with when I added the salt, just to give a little bit more gluten creation on the front end of this, which is a little bit heavy for the standard tartine recipe, but I think I need to do this to get some of these other varieties to work out, particularly the no-knead loaf and the coil folded loaf. So doing a little bit more turning here than I normally would, but this is really firming up nicely. Looks really good. You can see the gluten strands developing. As I pull the dough, you can see, it's lifting up out of the bowl. Even at this point, I've only been doing this for 3 minutes. Some people do this step for 10 minutes. So this is still a really relatively light touch. Okay, and now I'm seeing that this isn't changing much as I'm continuing. I'm just getting the same type of feel as I'm going around the bowl. Not a whole lot more development. So I think it's about time to wrap up this step. Here we are. So we've added the salt. We did a little bit of gluten creation here on the front end. Now we move to the next phase where I'm going to let this sit for 20 minutes. And this is where the recipe then diverges as we move into the next step of handling and bulk fermentation. So I've let the dough rest here on the countertop after adding the salt for about 20 minutes. If you consult the tartine book, this is one of the confusing things in the book that was later clarified, is that there was not a rest time specified in the book between adding the salt and doing the first stretch and fold. This was later clarified that there should be a 20 to 30 minute rest period for the dough to relax, which seemed pretty obvious because the dough was so tight after adding the salt, but I just wanted to clarify that for any people who are new to the tartine recipe. Okay, so the first thing I like to do is take the temperature. We're sitting at 81 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 27.2 degrees Celsius. We're right in the sweet spot of that range. I look at the dough in the bowl. You can see that it's relaxed down against the sides of the bowl, which we would expect. I can see the gluten strands on the top, so it's clear that we're building some gluten. So now we are ready to divide the loaves. I'm going to divide these into 5 equal sections and start diverging for our experimental purposes here into our 5 experimental loaves. So I'll first turn the dough out onto the countertop. Now I will divide this, and I'm going to weigh these portions to try to get 5 exactly equal portions. Based on my calculations, 1/5 of this dough should be about 492.6 grams each, if my calculations are correct. So I've divided the dough into 5 equal segments. So now, as I mentioned earlier, we're going to do different type of handling across all 5 of these loaves. Some of them will do no handling, like the no knead loaf. Some of them will do 4 rounds of stretch and folds or coil folds. The longest one we'll do is loaf number 3, which will be 8 stretch and folds. So I'm going to call these rounds and try to keep these consistent. I'm going to do a 30-minute break between each one of these. So we'll do a round of handling, then we'll let it sit for 30 minutes. We'll do another round. Sometimes people, especially when they do coil folds or lamination, will let the dough sit for 45 minutes or 60 minutes between rounds, just to try to keep everything consistent. I'm going to do 30-minute breaks between each rounds unless I decide to do something towards the end here, and I'll let you know if I change my mind. Okay, so let's start with round number 1. Round 1, our no knead dough is done. I'm not going to touch this dough until we put it into our shaping basket. So we're done with loaf number 1, no knead. We're going to let the yeast do all the work there and see what happens during bulk fermentation. Loaf number 2, this is our tartine light handling. This is where we're going to do the 4 stretch and folds that are the minimum recommended in tartine. So let me demonstrate the stretch and fold process. Now, in all these loaves, I'm working with a smaller mass of dough than you normally would work with if you were doing, the whole 1,000-gram flour weight bulk fermentation. So the dough doesn't quite behave exactly the same way when you're stretching the smaller mass of dough. It's a little bit like if you were on the moon in 1/6 the gravity of the earth. You have to wear weighted boots to hold yourself down. The same thing's going to happen here. When I try to stretch this dough out of the bowl, it's going to come out of the bowl a little bit quicker and more easily than if I had the full 1,000 grams of flour weight in each bowl. So my technique here will have to be modified a little bit just based on working with less mass, because I'm not getting the benefit of gravity. Okay, so the classic stretch and fold process that's described in tartine is you basically wet your hand, you reach down, you grab the dough, you pull it up as far as it'll go without tearing. So I'm getting good. That's what's called extensibility or stretching. I fold that over. I turn the bowl 90 degrees. I grab it again. I stretch, 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 let it come up as far as it will go. I fold that down again. Turn 90 degrees. I'm on my 3rd fold here. Now here I'm come up out of the bowl, so I have to hold it a little bit. That's my 3rd stretch. And then the 4th stretch, again, I have to hold the other end of it. So there's our 4 stretch and folds. That counts as 1 round of stretch and fold for our loaf number 1. Moving on to loaf number 2, this is the exact same process, and I'll be doing 8 rounds in this one, loaf number 3. I stretch, stretch, stretch as far as that'll go. I fold it over, stretch, and fold. I'm just going to hold the bottom, stretch. This is getting tight already. That's from the gluten development that we've seen just from that pre-mixing. That is a lot of elasticity. Elasticity is where the dough wants to pull back against you. Extensibility is the ability to stretch it. So we're seeing both here. That's loaf number 3. Loaf number 4, this is our coil fold. So let me demonstrate how to do the coil fold. So this is the classic coil fold. I reach down and grab the front 1/3 of the loaf and lift that up. Well, I leave the back portion of the loaf attached to the pan and I stretch that up. Then I fold it down over itself. Turn the pan 180 degrees. I repeat that process where I stretch the front and I leave the back attached to the bottom and fold that over. So that's my first coil. Then I turn the bowl 90 degrees and I start my second coil. Same process. Pull the front, leave the back attached, flip it under, turn 180 degrees, lift the front, leave the back attached, fold that over. That's my coil fold. Loaf number 5, we'll also do a coil fold for round 1. I lift the front, stretch the back, fold the front under, turn 180 degrees, lift the front, stretch the back, fold the front under, turn 90 degrees, lift the front, fold it under, fold it under. There's my coil fold for number 5. So let's also recap how many layers did we just create in each one of these loaves. Loaf number 1, I didn't create any layers and I'm not going to create any. That's my no need. Loaf number 2, I did the 4 rotations on the stretch and fold. I added 4 layers. Loaf number 3, I did the exact same thing. 4 turns of the stretch and fold, 4 layers. And then with the coil folds, if you remember, for loaves number 4 and 5, each time we do a coil fold, we add 8 layers. So to do the tally of our loaves, 0 layers, 4 layers, 4 layers, 8 layers, 8 layers. We'll keep a running tally here as we go, because adding the layers is really one of the most important differences that we'll see in the handling of these loaves. Now I let these rest for 30 minutes and we'll come back and do round 2. Okay, we are on to round 2. I'm alternating putting the loaves into my proofing chamber, which is my oven with the light on. The temperature in there is about 85 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 29.4 degrees Celsius. I'm trying to keep the internal dough temperature around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 26.7. So loaf number 1, our no knead loaf, we don't touch that one anymore. Now on round 2, I'm doing my tartine light loaf, 4 more folds. So now you can see I'm getting really good extensibility on this dough. It's really coming up out of the bowl even more than the last time. On turn number 1, turn number 2, the dough feels a little more supple. Turn number 3, I hold it down again. And turn number 4, that dough looks pretty good for round 2 of stretch and fold. Loaf number 3, which is my tartine heavy handling. We're going to do a lot more stretching and folding on this. Should look exactly the same as loaf number 1. It does. It feels really nice. The dough is really soft. Getting a good stretch on fold number 2. Tightens up a little on number 3. It tightens up on fold number 4. So on these 2 loaves, number 2 and number 3, the 2 tartine loaves, now I've added 4 more folds to each one. So I've done a total of 8 layers on loaf number 2, 8 layers on loaf number 3. Now for our coil folded loaves, loaves number 4 and 5, you can see that this hasn't fully relaxed up against the edges of this dish. That's why some people will let this relax 45 minutes or an hour. I'm just trying to keep the timing consistent here, so I want to move forward with this one. This is loaf number 4, which is our 4 coil folds. I lift the front, leave the back attached, fold it under, lift, and fold. That's a good coil fold. Turn it 90 degrees, do the same thing again from the other angle. Lift the front, fold it under. So I'm doing a little stretching with each coil fold, but it's more about the layers than it is with the stretching. I'm not getting those huge extensible stretches the way that I do with the tartine loaves. So now I've done 8 and 8 layers. I'm up to 16 total layers on loaf number 4, and here's loaf number 5. Get a little stretch on that first one. It's my first coil. Turn 90 degrees. There we are. So round 2 is done. 8 layers total, 8 total, 16 total, 16 total. Back into my proofing chamber, oven with the light on. I'm going to cover these now so they don't dry out. Okay, we are on to round 3. Loaf 1, the no knead loaf. There's still no need to do anything. That is bulk fermenting in my proofing chamber. Loaf number 2 is our tartine light loaf, light handling. This is where we are going to do 4 stretch and folds, which is the minimum required or recommended in the book. So where we are right now is we're on stretch and fold number 3 for loaf number 2. So what people typically do is you do more aggressive stretching, in particular on stretch and fold 1 and 2 for tartine. As you start to get to stretch and fold 3 and 4, you do a little bit lighter touch on this and focus a little bit more on folding and a little bit less on stretching, typically. Instead of pulling this all the way up like I did before, I just pull it lightly and fold it over. Turn 90 degrees. I'm basically just stretching enough to be able to pull it to the other side of the bowl. There we are. Then I like to size that up and see how it's standing up in the bowl, so you can see that we're getting some structure in the loaf there. I'm seeing some bubbles on top, so the fermentation is very active. So that's stretch and fold number 3 for a tartine loaf. For loaf number 3, which is our tartine heavy handled loaf, I'm still going to stretch away on this one. So I'm doing the full strength. Look at this. I'm getting, really up out of the bowl there, fairly aggressively. Stretching, shaking, really using gravity to get the maximum stretch. Give that a little pull from the bottom. This is a little bit like taffy pulling with this small loaf. There we are. That's my heavy handled tartine, stretch and fold number 3. Coil fold, this is 3 of 4 for this loaf. So we don't do anything differently on folds 3 and 4 like we did for tartine. We do them a little bit more gently. Coil fold is pretty gentle to begin with. So we just do the same thing. We stretch it up, roll it under, stretch it up, fold it under, turn 90, stretch and fold under. Last one. You can see this is firming up a little bit where it's coming way up out of the pan now. So we're getting nice structure on that loaf. Number 4, that's our coil fold. And then loaf number 5, this is where we're going to do something differently with this one, a different type of handling called lamination. So I'm going to turn this out onto my countertop. So I'm going to turn this out onto my countertop. There we are. Now with lamination, basically what I want to do is stretch this out as thinly as possible, as if I were going to make a giant pizza dough out of this. So I'm going to use my bench scraper. I'm going to wet my hands a little bit because this dough is incredibly sticky. So the first thing I do is pull it to this side. Next, pull to this side. And then I pull from this side down here. I'm really getting a good stretch here. You can see that the gluten is developing nicely. It's almost like I'm doing a giant window pane pull here. So I stretched this out roughly into a giant square that looks like if I were going to make a giant square pizza, which is incredibly tempting right now. But I'm not going to do that. In the interest of science, we need to keep moving along. So now the lamination is basically I do 3 trifolds. I grab the top, fold it 1/3 of the way over. I grab the bottom, fold this over. I grab this side, fold to the center. And I grab this side, fold to the center. And there I have my nice, neat, laminated package. Back into my pan. Now, the question a lot of people ask is, how does the lamination differ from the coil fold? Because we actually created the same number of layers. We create 8 layers by doing lamination, exactly the same as the 8 layers that we create by doing coil fold. But with the lamination, what you could see I did was I stretched the dough much more than I did during coil folding. So I really stretched this to its limits in the laminated loaf versus the coil folding. I'm doing a real gentle stretching. So this gives me one really aggressive stretch kind of in the middle of the bulk fermentation handling process if I'm doing lamination. Otherwise, it's creating the same number of layers as the coil fold. So let's recap how many layers we've created now. We have our no-knead loaf in the proofing chamber that has 0 layers. It's just a ball of dough. Tartine light handling, we've done 3 stretch and folds, that's 12 layers. Tartine heavy handling, 3 stretch and folds, that's 12 layers. Coil folding, we've done 3 coil folds now, so that's 24 layers, so double the amount of layers that we have in these 2. And the coil fold with lamination, same thing, we've done 24 layers. Just looking at what the loaves look like sitting here, or what the dough looks like sitting here, they all look a little bit different. I mean, these 2 look similar. Standing up a little bit more like a round bowl, they have some shape. The coil fold looks probably the best of the 4, really has a lot of structure due to that gentle handling. The lamination is clearly taller because I got a lot of height in that last fold, but it's a little bit of an irregular shape now, so that's got to relax before I get that back into a shape like loaf number 4. But these are all progressing about at the same level right now. Okay, it's round 4. We are 90 minutes into bulk fermentation. Let's do a check-in on all 4 loaves. So I'm going to take the temperature of a couple of these. 81 degrees Fahrenheit, that's 27.2. 80 degrees Fahrenheit, 26.7 Celsius. That one's a little cooler, 77 degrees Fahrenheit. That's about 25 degrees Celsius. So there's a little bit of variability depending on where these are sitting in my oven with the light on, depending on how close they are to the light bulb. I'm going to start mixing them up a little bit in there to try to keep the average temperature around 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 26.7 degrees Celsius. The reason I'm so focused on that temperature is because I want all these to finish bulk fermentation at the same time. So I like to keep them in that exact temperature range because then I typically know how long this dough takes to finish bulk fermentation. Okay, loaf number 1, this is our no-knead dough. That's really bubbling around the sides of the vessel, so there's some good fermentation going on in there. It's risen very slightly since I started that one. We're not doing anything with the no-knead. With loaf number 2, this is our tartine using the lightest possible handling. This is going to be the last round of stretch and folds, the 4th stretch and fold. Let's do a window pane test on this. I grab the corner of the dough, I pull it up, That's pretty good gluten development. The dough always tears because of the whole wheat in the dough, but that's pretty good gluten development there on loaf number 2. So we just do one more stretch and fold on this, and then this one's going to be done. So this is my last stretch and fold. And again, on the last 2 stretch and folds, number 3 and 4, you want to be a little bit lighter and not do as much of the stretching. This is a little bit more of a folding emphasis than stretching. And again, with these small loaves, I have to grab the bottom and hold that in place, especially when I'm wetting my hands and it's getting the dough wet, it's not sticking to the bowl. So this dough has a lot of elasticity. As I'm pulling on it, it's pulling back away from me. I shape that into a little bit of a round. That's as much as we're going to do on this loaf. This is kind of the standard tartine loaf. Now let's recap what we've done on this loaf. So in terms of gluten development, which is our primary objective of the bulk fermentation handling experiment that we're looking at here, we did not do a long autolyse, which builds gluten. Some people will do multiple hours or even overnight autolyse. We did a fairly short fermentolyse with the leaven added for 40 minutes. We added the salt, and I mixed the dough by hand for about 3 minutes, I believe, with the salt. So I did not do an excessive amount of handling when I added the salt, because that also develops gluten. Then we did 4 stretch and folds. The first 2 fairly aggressive, the last 2 not very aggressive. So we did not do a huge amount of gluten development through handling of the dough through the stretch and folds. So that's what makes tartine a little bit tricky, is that this is very much a yeast-centric outcome where you need a super strong starter to really carry this to the finish line now, because we're not doing any more handling on this. And we really did, other than a no-knead recipe, this is a fairly minimal amount of handling on tartine. So I'm going to put this into my proofing chamber with the no-knead, and now we're going to watch those to see how they rise for the latter, say, 90 minutes to 2.5 hours of bulk fermentation. The target range for bulk fermentation in the tartine recipe is 3 to 4 hours. We're at 90 minutes right now, so we'll let these go another 90 minutes. We'll check back in on those. Loaf number 4, I'm going out of sync here as well, is because this one is also at its end point. So on loaf number 4, we're going to do 4 coil folds. This is the last one. There's my 4th coil fold. Now let's look at this loaf. So I did 4 coil folds on this. It had the same Fermentolyse, the same hand mixing to add the salt. But by doing 4 coil folds, we added 8 layers each time we did that. So I've created 32 layers in this dough. Contrast that with my tartine, where I did 4 stretch and folds of 4 layers each time. I have 16 layers in here. So you can see, just looking at the 2 loaves, I mean, there's a lot more structure in the coil folded loaf because I added twice as many layers to it. The tartine is kind of a ball of dough. This is going to let the yeast do its thing. We're going to get an irregular open crumb here. On the coil folded loaf, I can already tell we're going to get more regularity in the crumb because we've added so many more layers as compared to the light touch tartine. So these are our 2 loaves that are done now with handling, ready to go into bulk fermentation. Now let's back up to loaf number 3. This is my tartine heavy handling. This is my 4th round of stretch and folds. I'm trying to keep track of all this. I'm going to do a window pane on this one as well, just to get a sense of where we are. Theoretically, it should be exactly the same as loaf number 1. It is. That's a really good window pane right there. I mean, a lot of gluten development, good translucency. But we're just going to push the envelope with this loaf, because a lot of people just like to keep handling their dough. They just keep stretching, they keep folding. We're going to see what happens. And I'm going to try to catch up the amount of layers in this dough as I had in loaf number 4, the coil folding. And again, because this is such a small mass of dough and I'm doing so much stretching, look at this, I can barely pull that. There's a lot of elasticity in this dough. This dough is getting really tight because the tartine, through the stretch and folds, you do get more of that extensibility, which builds elasticity in the dough, not so much in the coil fold. So I mean, look at these two compared to each other. They just have a different kind of shape to them. This is a little bit more irregular shape because I'm doing that crazy pulling. This is a really tight loaf, and the coil folded loaf is a little more organized, a little bit more well behaved because I've been a little bit less aggressive. Now lastly, on loaf number 5, this was our loaf where we did 2 coil folds and lamination. We are going to do 2 more coil folds on this one. So we're a little past the halfway point here. When I did the lamination, this loaf lost its shape a little bit. I'm going to try to reshape this a little bit with a little bit more gentle coil fold. This one's coming up off the bottom of the pan as well, so you're getting gluten development there. The dough is strengthening because it's not stretching as much now. Got a lot of air bubbles in this one. So now this one is pretty much back to the shape of its neighbor here, loaf number 4. This one we did 4 coil folds. This one we did 2 coil folds, a lamination, and another coil fold. So they have the same number of layers in them, 32 layers in each one, versus the 2 tartine, 16 layers in each one of these. Okay, these 2 loaves I'm done handling. Number 2, tartine light handling, and the coil fold with 4 coil folds. These go into bulk fermentation along with Mr. No Knead here. We don't touch these, we just monitor these now. I'm gonna move the tartine and the coil fold loaf number 4 into the same type of vessel as my No Knead, so we can really monitor the height. I'm trying to do this carefully so that I don't lose that nice structure that we created, particularly on these coil folded loaves. That's really nice. That one sat down in there really nicely. And then the last thing I do is I put blue tape on the side of each one of these vessels to mark our starting point for the rest of bulk fermentation, so I can see what the percent rise is from this point forward. The tartine recipe calls for 20 to 30% rise in the dough, but I start that after the stretch and fold process. It's almost impossible to measure the height change of the dough when you're doing all the handling of the dough. So I mark it at this point. I usually go for 30% roughly increase in height. Like I said, we're 90 minutes into bulk fermentation. We'll check these periodically and see where we end up. All these go back into my proofing chamber. We're a little bit below the midpoint of my target temperature. 80 degrees Fahrenheit is where I want to be. We're slightly below that. 26.7 degrees Celsius, we're slightly below. So that's why I'm keeping these in my oven with the light on. I have my air conditioning running in here today. My room temperature is 75 degrees Fahrenheit, which is about 24 degrees Celsius. So these are getting a little bit cool when I take them out and doing all this handling. So these go back into a warm environment, which they prefer. Moving on. So we are on to round number 5. We have 2 loaves where we're still doing handling in bulk fermentation. Let me just pause and talk about what we're trying to accomplish with these 2 loaves. Loaf number 4, this is our heavy-handed tartine loaf. This is where we're going to continue to do 8 stretch and folds to be able to compare it to the minimum recommended stretch and folds in tartine, which was our loaf number 2, which was 4 stretch and folds. So this is basically double the number of stretch and folds recommended as the minimum. By doing double the amount, this also will have the exact same number of layers as loaf number 4, which was our 4 coil folds. So we will be able to compare, does the exact same number of layers in stretch and fold equal the layers in coil fold, even though the handling is half as much? Meaning in 4 coil folds, we had 32 layers that we built, and that takes 8 stretch and folds to build 32 layers. So this will be a good comparison of just 2 basic technique differences: stretch and fold 32 layers, coil fold 32 layers. Loaf number 5, this is where we did 2 coil folds, we did a lamination, we're going to do 2 more coil folds. And this is really just a test of the extreme to say, is more always better? By the time we're done with this, we will have 48 layers that we've built in this loaf. So it'll be a good example to see, are there some diminishing returns once you start overhandling a loaf? That's what we're trying to accomplish with these 2. So back to loaf number 3. This is our tartine heavy-handed. I can't stop handling my dough. I just keep stretching and stretching. Still getting a good stretch there. This doesn't really feel very different from the prior time I stretched it. I basically get 2 stretches before it really comes out of the bowl. And then on 3 and 4, I have to use my other hand here. That's tight. The 4th one, I'm barely getting a 4th stretch there without ripping. That is a tight loaf. So that's our 5th stretch and fold. That means we built 20 layers. Now for this coil fold, this will be our 4th coil fold. We also did a lamination, so this is our 5th handling of this one. Now this dough is still pretty extensible. It still feels pretty supple, getting a good stretch there. I do my first coil, turn 90 degrees. Now here you can see this loaf is really tightening up as well. The 5th time around, I'm not getting very much stretch just from gravitational pull. So I'm doing a little more handling here to actually get this to stretch and roll over into the 2nd coil. So we're seeing this one start to tighten up, similar to what we're seeing in tartine, going into our 5th round of handling on both of these. These go back into the proofing chamber for 30 more minutes. Okay, we are on round 6. We have 2 loaves still in progress. We have our tartine heavy handling. This is our 6th stretch and fold for this one. The dough is tightening up. I can't pull it as far out of the bowl as I could earlier. It's very supple, really nice feeling dough, but it's getting pretty tight. 2, 3, and that 4th fold, I can't get anything out of the 4th fold. So this is turning into a real, what people would call muscular dough, where it's got a little bit too much elasticity in it now. It's getting to be real tense and tight. So that's going to continue for 2 more rounds. And then this is the last round for loaf number 5. This is our coil folding with lamination. So we did 2 coil folds, 1 lamination, and then 2 more coil folds. This is the 5th coil fold, 6th total operation. So I do my coil fold again. And this dough still feels pretty soft to the touch, but I'm not getting as much of a stretch out of the pan. I fold it forward. I fold it under. I fold it forward. And I fold it under. That's a nice tight package. So that's it for this loaf. This one goes into its bulk fermentation vessel. Try to keep as much of that structure as I can without disrupting that. That looks real nice. This joins the other ones in the proofing chamber. We'll just do a temperature test on this one to see where we are. We are at 80 degrees Fahrenheit, right where I want to be, 26.7, right in the midpoint of that target range for bulk fermentation. Let's this one keep going. We'll see him 2 more times. Okay, round 7, our dough temperature is still 80 degrees Fahrenheit, which is 26.7 degrees Celsius. This is the 7th time I'm doing the stretch and fold for the tartine. Now this is my second to last time, so I'm going to be a little more gentle with it, even though I've really overhandled this quite a bit. And similar to when I was lifting it out of the bowl, I can barely get that 4th fold because the dough is so tight. Just giving it a little shaping there in the bottom of the bowl. Nothing else to report here. That's round 7. The last one will be in 30 minutes, round 8. Okay, we are on the 8th and last round of stretching and folding. This is our heavy-handled tartine loaf. So let me do the final fold. As with the prior one, when you get into these last folds, especially late in the process, we're 3.5 hours into bulk fermentation now. You don't want to be handling the dough a lot, so I'm just doing a real light, the lightest fold that I've done yet. That's it. Now that dough is really softening up quite a bit. Now we're really into bulk fermentation. The dough's aerating more. So just a reminder, why did we do this loaf? Really, I wanted to show that 8 stretch and folds, which creates 32 layers, is the same number of layers as 4 coil folds, which creates 32 layers. So we'll be comparing this dough to the coil folded loaf to compare the two and see how they look. Also, we'll compare this extreme handled tartine loaf to the very light handled tartine loaf, just to compare how much variability you really have based on interpretation of that recipe. Okay, so this goes back in the proofing chamber. We'll check on everything at the 4-hour mark. Okay, we are at the 4-hour mark of bulk fermentation. I'm just checking on all the dough. This one is our loaf number 2, the tartine light handling loaf. This has risen, I'd say maybe 20% max. It's domed up on top a little bit. I'm starting to see some bubbles on the top, but this doesn't quite look like it's done yet compared to the typical 30% rise in height that I would see. So I'm going to give these a little bit more time and keep an eye on them.